Bienvenue à la webdiffusion. N'hésitez pas à poser vos questions lors de la présentation en les inscrivant dans l'espace prévu à cet effet. Nous vous souhaitons une bonne webdiffusion.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Bienvenue à ce panel organisé par l'Agence de mobilité durable, une ville accessible en 2030, quelles actions mettre en œuvre? Et bienvenue pour ceux qui sont physiquement avec nous à la Maison du développement durable. Peut-être que c'est votre première visite en ces lieux, donc on espère que vous apprécierez. Merci de vous être déplacés en grand nombre, puis merci.
You will enjoy the presentation, and thank you for being here in large numbers, and also all of those who are attending from a distance, because it is a live cast as well. Please know that translation is available. Let me introduce myself quickly. I'm Gabrielle Lamontagne-Allais. I'm a passionate journalist with respect to these questions of accessibility. And I also have been working in the press and in the radio, and I currently work for Feu Vert, which is a show that deals with environment, and that is available on Radio-Canada on Sundays for those who are interested. So I'm very happy for being with you today, and I will be moderating today's panel. And as you know, accessibility is a bit of a blind spot with respect to sustainable mobility, among others. And if we're not ourselves limited to accessibility issues, or if we don't know close ones who have such issues, well, we may not be quite aware of its importance. It's quite a privilege not to have such constraints with regards to accessibility. And for example, I've often heard young mothers who had to first begin to moving with a baby trolley in the city realized accessibility issues. And I was also a young mother in 2021, and I have to agree, I was certainly looking for automatic doors, elevators, appropriate street curbs and ramps, and oh my goodness, these were like oasis. And I would even say that we schedule things according to what we find with respect to accessibility. And I had to study the subway map, where there were subways and so on. And let me say it, I realized that some of my freedom was curtailed because there were not elevators in every subway station. And essentially, these are questions and issues that are important and varied. So a city that is accessible to all in 2030, this is the mission and the vision of the City of Montreal that is also included in its strategic organizational plan. And what we want to do today is to identify levers and obstacles to making Montreal a truly accessible and inclusive city for all. We will also take stock of the efforts underway and those that remain to be done to translate this vision into public space, including curb and parking. Now, before we begin, please know that you are welcome to use the following hashtag. So hashtag RDV Agence Mobilité MTL. So don't hesitate to use this. This said, I would also ask you to please go in mute if this has not already been done, so as to ensure a smooth unfolding of the panel. So let me now introduce our four panelists. So Sandrine Cabana-Degani, which is Executive Director with Piéton Québec, Pierre-Étienne Gendron-Landry, which is General Manager for Société Logique. Hello, hello. And from a distance, Amélie Myriam Plante. I believe she's close to Rimouski today, and she's a land use planning professional for Anthropole. Hello, Amélie. Hello. And finally, Juan Torres, who is an urban planner and full professor at the School of Urban Planning and Landscape Architecture at the University of Montreal, and who is also Assistant Vice Rector for Undergraduate Studies and Content. Thank you. Okay, now let me begin perhaps with the first question so that we have a common definition for all of us. So what do we mean by an inclusive city? So who might want to break the ice in this respect? Well, this brings up quite a bit. So economic accessibility, territorial accessibility. At Société Logique, we work at universal accessibility. So this means that anybody, regardless of cognitive, perceptual abilities, or physical abilities, has access to space in the same way as autonomous people. So this is our definition, but we can also go further. What are economic issues? Regardless of my revenue, do I access the space, the territory? And with respect to infrastructures, can I move through the space? Culturally speaking, well, our society is changing in this respect quite quickly. And so depending on where I come from, what is accessibility? This is also something we need to study. And then there are gender issues to take into consideration. So are we a mother, a woman, a young child? And as you mentioned, women are all, in charge of families, so they have a lot to think about. So accessibility is about multiple perspectives. What I would also add is that Pierre-Etienne, everything that you've broached, I agree with, but there are some people who don't always have a choice or would like to walk to different places. So there might be accessibility issues. So there's also, how does one want to move in a given space, walk or a vehicle or so on? And then there's also a question of age. Are we a child? Can we walk through a park to go see our friends? And then there's also an issue of safety and ease. So not only accessible, but also to be able to move safely and to feel safe. Yes, indeed. So that, our heart doesn't start to beat when we don't feel safe. Juan, what I would also add is an additional challenge. A city is a concentration of resources. And when we speak of an accessible city, well, resources must be accessible to everyone. And this is also something that is not always easy to define. What does this mean? Let's think of spatial characteristics that allows everybody to fully benefit. So we may have certain ideas about what this means in 2023, but this could evolve in time and be different in 2030. So when we think, for example, of just our own person, how we will have changed in 7 years from now, children of today will be teenagers tomorrow. So there's a transformation issue that is constant. And this is something to think about as well. And yes, I agree with what my colleagues have brought up, but it's also a process that is always evolving with respect to understanding transformation, evolution. So there are also many differences that manifest itself within the space, and how, again, do we bring this into accessibility issues for all? Now we have, I agree as well. This is Miriam speaking. So an accessible city for all, as far as I'm concerned, is a city where people can participate socially, namely, and this could mean something as simple as doing the groceries. And we can do this independently, or we could do this with the help of a close one or an employee who might step out, for example, of the grocery store to make such a store accessible. It's also a continuum, as has been mentioned. or a chain with different links, and we need to be aware of where the links may break or not be solid. In addition, there's something to be said about communication, education, information. Do we know what spaces are accessible? And if we don't know, this also affects this whole issue of accessibility. Now, let's also think of equity, how we help with respect to equity. And once again, yes, safety, also attractiveness. And of course, we'd like to have a diversity of options anywhere we go, but it's also difficult to make it so. Juan, you were alluding to this constant evolution. Things are always changing. So I'd like to ask you, how has the idea of accessibility evolved over time? Because I imagine, if we think 30 years ago, there's been quite a lot of change. Yes, you're right. We can think about it maybe as a value. We give it importance, but this idea of importance has also evolved through time. So during the 20th century, for example, after the world wars, well, it became clear that there was a necessity to reintegrate war vets who had different forms of disabilities. And this then created beginning efforts to implement various measures, not only for individuals, but also for the common spaces. Yes, this happened in the United States. Yes, it did, but also throughout, in North America, in Europe. And what we also notice is that the demography has changed, which brings talent, resources. And when we think of the elderly, there are different compensations to be thought of. How do we compensate for the fact that somebody gets older? What tools do we make available to favor decision making with regards to accessibility? And there are also physical constraints, and how do we help in this respect? So as society evolves and we recognize the legitimate value of accessibility, well, we need to reflect, we need to observe, we need to adapt. Let us think of, how do we implement doors in different spaces, etc. And let us think also of teenagers. Well, teenagers, how do they feel that they have access to a space, almost beyond the actual accessibility, but also of how others look at them as they access certain spaces. So there is societal perception as well to consider. And so this brings us back to ideas of diversity and shared legitimacy. And Pierre-Etienne, we were mentioning universal accessibility. So has this evolved, in your opinion, over time? Yes, certainly. And also changes are taking place very quickly. Perspectives are changing fast. How do we move within a city? Things have changed. Let's look back in time. We were thinking of speed over a long distance, and now how do we have different options to move? And speed over distance is not necessarily the priority issue. So for example, maybe we go slower, but we are safer as we move. And there's also a variety of ways of moving within a city. And this is where we're looking more closely at this point in time. Let's think of a building as well. Yes, you can enter the building, but if this option does not meet your needs, are there other options to enter the building? Now, let us think also of the different people who would access a given building? Do they need to come with adapted vehicles and so on and so forth? So essentially, at the heart of reflection is who is using the space and what do they want to do in this space? So this could be habitual activities, daily activities, and so on and so forth. Well, 2023, we see that there are still much work to do. Let's think of the subway in 2023. So let's address the idea of obstacles when we think of an accessible city. So Amélie, Myriam, do you have something to say? Okay, I'll break the ice here. Well, what comes to mind is that working in silos that is not collaborative, well, in other words, there are different teams working, say, within the city. And as Juan was saying earlier, that he works with teenagers. So Juan is a specialist with teenagers, whereas I work with elderly people. And so what happens is that, for example, with my elderly people, there are certain teams that work on leisure activities, then a different team that is on space planning. So when we're thinking of universal policies with regards to land use planning or urban planning, what is important is that all the teams that are working in this respect speak to each other, because if they don't, we can lose some pieces. And when we think of public policies, you mentioned the subway earlier on. Well, there is an increasing number of subway stations that have become accessible, but it's still not true for all. And when we think of the private sectors, well, there is quite a lot to do. These are my quick thoughts. So you mentioned working in silos, lack of connection between teams. What other obstacles can we identify? Well, with regards to pedestrians, what I would say, says Sabrine Cabana-Degani, well, it's about planning in daily spaces and policies with regards to vehicles on the street have an impact on our living spaces, the greater environment around us. So, of course, there are beautiful examples that take into consideration pedestrians, among others, but it's not the case everywhere. So, for example, this is true when we leave central neighborhoods. We go more towards the outskirts. Well, sometimes there isn't always sidewalks. Vehicles may be driving quickly. And then there's also access to services within one's vicinity. If we need to drive 10 kilometers to go to the groceries or to go to a restaurant, well, that also is about accessibility to the city, because if somebody doesn't have a car in this case, well, access to essential services, if we think of groceries, for example, it becomes difficult. Juan, well, an additional obstacle is that this idea of process that we have addressed is not only incremental. It's not only about adding elements. It's more a challenge of arbitration. In other words, yes, we may be able to use a resource, but as we arbitrate, we may need to limit the use of the space for use by certain people in the population. So who wins, who loses, and how do we find the balance? This is a collective decision, a political decision, not always easy. Yes, people pull on their side of the rope, don't they? Well, yes. And it also means to prioritize certain uses of the space, which is normal. But it also creates obstacle as we move forward, because sometimes we need to take away some rights or privileges that people may, think are essential or take for granted, and then this stirs various issues. So the needs of somebody with a car are different from a pedestrian, are different from somebody, say, with a disability. So how to find the balance so that everybody benefits from the space? So it's not only spatial issues, but it may be on a timeline. At what time is it accessible for this segment of the population, and so on and so forth? So it is not an easy question, once again, to define what is accessibility, especially if we think 30 years ahead of time, as we've mentioned before. But we do need to raise the questions so as to be aware of our blind spots and to accept that there will always be blind spots. And the best way to avoid them is to, look on the right, look on the left, observe as much as possible. Pierre-Etienne, well, one of the obstacles that is linked to what Juan has just said, well, it's the tendency to create categories of people and to compare needs, if not oppose them, when really there isn't an opposition. Now, I work in universal accessibility, and let me give you an example. Pedestrians and people who take a bicycle are put in opposition, and they fight for the sidewalk. I'm just giving you a caricature. But yes, this is an issue of, for example, do we leave a space accessible for a very small minority of people? One of the questions we may ask is, you who is rather independent, will you always have this independence of mobility? So perhaps there is a day in the future where you will be grateful for what is being done with regards to accessibility. So when we think of cyclists and the use of the road, well, it's very much a question of a balancing act. And when we collaborate with the different teams and parties with the different needs, well, we can affect the space and make room for everybody, because we find that there are complementary needs. So what I'd say to summarize is, where are the common zones as opposed to the opposing zones when we think of needs? Amélie Myriam. Well, quickly, Gabrielle, as you were saying from the beginning, when you were speaking of mothers with the baby trolleys, well, when we are a parent, there are particular needs which are not unlike the needs of the elderly people. So, for example, a place to rest, even access to public washrooms. I mean, access to washrooms is important for very young children as it is for elderly people. Well, that's a very concrete example. Thank you very much. Okay. And as you know, the agency works on different issues with respect to parking management, street curbs, and so on. So what would you have to say in these respects to make the city more accessible? Are there measures that can discourage accessibility? Well, again, street curbs and parking. Well, there's quite a bit we can do with respect to street curbs. For example, we've noticed in the last few years that there are locations where people can sit down to have a chat, and this could definitely bring life to a neighborhood while favoring a feeling of safety. Because as we walk by, well, there are people chatting, there are other people who are there. Therefore, again, this sentiment of safety being encouraged. And once again, places to rest. They can be used by families, by friends, and so on and so forth. And back to the idea of safety, to clear intersections 5 meters away from the intersection. Well, this is very helpful for pedestrians because they can see the cars or bicycles that are coming. So this said, by making this space clear at intersections, well, we lose parking places. This said, we do gain quite a lot in accessibility. For example, close to an intersection, there could be a place to park bicycles. Yes, the planning of roads and lanes is important. And when we think of street curbs, well, is it to be used for heavy vehicles? When we know that 90% of the time the vehicles are not moving, it's essentially parked, unless people are sharing vehicles, of course. So, you know, when we think of universal accessibility, well, we can think of the bus system and making spaces where it becomes easy to board the bus, where a taxi can also stop, perhaps. So thinking of what's happening on our street curbs actually allows for some leeway when it is thought of in a global way. It favors resilience and it favors multi-use. So sometimes people fight over a couple of feet of road or street curb, which is difficult, but the idea, once again, is an idea of finding balance for those who need to use vehicles and those who use different forms of transportation. That was Pierre-Etienne. Yes, we were talking about arbitration and everybody pulling on their side of the rope. Well, when we think of dedicated cycle lanes, what kind of blind spots are there here with respect to accessibility, despite measures for collective means of transportation? Juan speaking. Well, this is about users, and this is about considering the uses themselves. It's not only about sharing, co-living, it's also about the type of activities. And this is a reminder that a road is more than a road. It is a public space. It's a collective resource. Yes, it is indispensable to go from A to B, for example, but when we go from A to B, well, we are wide awake most of the time. We are perceiving an environment, if not be subject to an environment, depending on the use of the land. We could feel stigmatized, we could feel endangered, or feel open. So the space can be used for so many different uses. You were talking about places for conversation, you know, places where there could be shows as well. These are multi-use spaces, and this is sometimes lost when we give too much importance to certain uses. And if we especially prioritize mobility, a street isn't only about mobility. We've addressed safety, for example, as people move through this space. And when we think of these places where people can converse and stop, it allows people to have to live in this space according to their own projects. So we're back to the idea of independence, of feeling present in a city that is accessible for many. So we are essentially addressing the idea of adaptation, transformation, all the while knowing that this sharing of this space brings up different conflicts, questions, obstacles, until we experiment with it. So yes, this is difficult, but the experimentation grows our awareness, grows our knowledge, grows the possibilities of what can be done. It allows for prototypes. It also allows for citizen involvement, do it yourself even. Now, and we can also become inspired by what is done in places different from our own. So essentially, how does the community shape the space in which it lives? So a matter of many choices here. Sabrine, well, it's also a matter of design. Sometimes the first time that we experiment with a space and this leads to a transformation, well, maybe yes, there are conflicts that come up. The design may be adjusted, but what we notice is that we can rework what we have done so as to find a better balance and mitigate conflicts, all the while looking to meet the needs of the different users. And this we see through different projects in the city. Yes, once again, frictions, conflicts come up, but the second time around, we do better. Now, can you give me concrete examples of exemplary projects or interesting with respect to accessibility and safety? Why not? What are examples that have unfolded in Quebec that may prove inspiring? Pierre-Etienne. Well, when we think of, there have been many projects in Montreal, and what we see, as has been mentioned, is that we try experiments, and then as we move in time and learn how the space has been used, has been experimented, well, we begin to integrate various issues, even if we can't do everything. But when we think of shared street spaces for pedestrians, for vehicles in Montreal, well, there's been wonderful initiatives. So, for example, with wonderful possibilities for people who may not see clearly to be able to walk through these spaces. And so in such experiments, for example, we have learned a lot, not only with respect to land use, but specialists who work with the disabilities of these people have also learned a lot. And let's think of the STM. It took a while before work begun with respect to accessibility. We took about 15 years before it actually started looking seriously at these issues and transforming accessibility in common transit. So, for quite a while, the subway stations were really not accessible. So, and once again, if we change a space, making a street only accessible to pedestrians, well, what happens? What do we learn? What do we do next time? So it's a matter of coherence and this challenge that we were talking about earlier. Amélie, do you have a project that comes to mind? Well, you were talking namely about safety, but I'd like to go back to what Juan was saying. There's also issues of attractiveness. So with respect to safety and ease of use, there's a project called Corridor Autonomie, Autonomous Corridor in the southwest of Montreal. And this is a project where elderly people can use cycling lanes. And this is a space where the different users gathered to consider what can be done with respect to the people living in the space. And here there were different things put in place so as to allow the elderly people to use the space more easily. Now, when we think of projects that allow support, we also need to think of shops who may need to make sure, for example, there is no ice in front of the door. So, for example, in Sherbrooke, there is a shop that sets forth the importance of making sure, for example, in the winter, that there is no ice at the door. When we think of leisure in Victoriaville, there are projects that are being deployed that is to make sure that well, yes, there are leisure initiatives, but there are also projects that favor mobility. And then there is support that is given to people who are using common transit, namely to get to a leisure activity, for example. So suddenly somebody who wasn't using a bus, for example, begins to use it. Okay, Sabrine, well, in Montreal, there are wonderful things that are being done in the center of the city to make it accessible to pedestrians. So, for example, sidewalks have been widened. And I would add that the street curb has been transformed in that there is no parking on certain sections of streets in the center of the city. So this definitely enhances safety, enhances the idea that people can walk in this sector. And for example, on this particular sector, there were people who were constantly looking for parking spaces, which attracted a lot of vehicles. So by cutting out the parking, well, it opened up space and certainly gives food for thought. Okay, Juan. Now, we have a project that is called Change the Rules of the Games that was done with Catherine Froley-Ick of the Public Health School of the University. And so there are roads that are dedicated to play, and there are others that are dedicated to mobility. When we think of children going to school or children who want to play, for example. And it's also the idea of expanding the possibilities of the use of the space. And here we think of leisure. So, for example, what children can do before they actually enter the school building. Can they play, for example? So, and still thinking of schools, which is not so much about reconfiguring the street, for example, or the immediate space. There have been measures such as the trottibus, and this allows people to increasingly use buses or increasingly use sidewalks. And it also favors the fact that parents can begin to go to school walking with their children. So it decomplexifies mobility. It allows use of the street by 6-year-olds, 8-year-olds with their family. So sometimes we can change measures, change the way it is used to also improve accessibility. Now, we were speaking of evolution. We were speaking about 2030 being different from 2023. I'd like to ask you what tendencies we should keep in mind when we think of current projects and future projects. So when we think of the future, what should we bear in mind so as to anticipate what may be coming? Quite the question, isn't it? Juan, let me go ahead. Well, there are climatic changes issues, yes, and equity, also inclusion, also diversification of the ecosystem. Once again, a matter of adaptation in several respects. And I would also say, as we were saying at the beginning of this event, or prior to the event, we addressed the idea of artificial intelligence. So how does artificial intelligence impact the use of public spaces? We've begun to see this, namely when we think of social media that allows us to get organized. For example, everybody at 4 o'clock, we meet at this place for a bike ride. So how will this unfold in the future? Would it always unfold while thinking of accessibility for all? May it be a deterrent? So definitely an angle we need to take, artificial intelligence, but all the while thinking of equity and inclusion. So it's not such a blind spot, actually, artificial intelligence. Yes. Okay, Pierre-Etienne. Well, I would also bring in the idea of empathy. And this is also what we hear about in university. Students ask that we speak of universal accessibility. So there's a tendency to take into consideration my own needs, but also becoming aware of other users and how their experience is very different. So in other words, it's not a binary world. It's not the people who are able, the people who are disabled, because people who have disabilities, well, it's not everybody all the same. So we're back to this idea of options, of choices. And the choices that you have today, will they be the same throughout your life? You know, we've talked about how we change as we age. And what I'm tempted to say, people, even if you're doing well today and you're healthy today, one day you will need to be in spaces that allow for accessibility. So, you know, I'm coming back to this idea that issues are not binary. We are diverse. Humanity is diverse. And the fact that these discussions are already taking place, well, it is reassuring for the future, this expanding of awareness of others. Thank you. Now, when we think of climatic changes, if we do not adapt our practices in the space, some segments of the population may be isolated. Let's think of our winters in Quebec, where there is sudden ice and then it melts and it comes back and so on and so forth. So this becomes difficult, say, for young mothers, for the elderly. So, you know, how do we move today, for example, given the climatic conditions? So, you know, this brings us to snow removal practices, and how do we ensure maintenance throughout? As these issues come up of very different days, and then what happens in the summer so we can fully benefit from the spaces. But then when we think of summer, there are days of very high heat, among others. So what happens in this case, when people need to go from one place to another, the elderly, for example, as it is very, very hot outside, then let's think of vehicles, their actual size, because this brings us back to the idea of street curbs. So the larger the vehicle, the larger the space the vehicle takes. So this will generate pressure on these people who use large vehicles. And it's also brings up the idea of safety, because in the case of an accident, injuries can be greater. So yes, well, thank you for bringing up these different perspectives. Miriam, yes, well, I'd like to once again bring back to the idea of the aging of population. In Shawinigan, over 40% of the people are above the age of 50. And we know that in regional centers, there are more older people, but this is also happening in Montreal. And so when we think of climatic changes, we need to think of needs once again, as Sabrine was saying. And there's also the idea that there are greater numbers of public consultation and reflecting together. So the more we consult with citizens, the more we favor accessibility and inclusion. And so we need to continue in this respect as we think of inclusive cities for the future. Now, one last question before we have public questions to you all. Now, are there resources that you know of that would be good to identify to improve access to spaces, and that it would be relevant to mention now to our audience? Okay, Pierre-Etienne. Well, in cooperative milieus and in social collaboration milieus, if we look at what's happening in space planning, well, there are wonderful projects taking place, and there is the issue of value-added elements of equity. So, let's think, for example, of Vélo Québec, of ourselves, Société Logique, but essentially there are organizations that exist currently that are involved in projects and that can favor projects. Universities as well. Juan. Well, we are at a time where there are several resources available. We don't need to cross the city to go to a library. There is a lot virtually available. We can find documents that inform us. Let us think of guides, of lists of best practices, of data sets. And let's speak actually of an elephant in the room with us today. The fact that the ownership of cars has been increasing, and the data is available with the SAC, and there is a tool that allows us to know how many there are vehicles in a different region. So I invite you to go use these tools from the SAAQ. And as we tried out these tools with some of my students in the masters, well, we see that if we lined up all the cars in Montreal, if we put them one after the other, we would have enough cars between Montréal and Baie-Saint-Paul that are added every year, namely in Montreal. So that's a lot. So this adds pressure to life in the city. Or actually, the line of cars from Montreal to Baie-Saint-Paul represents the increase in the last 15 years. So once again, there are different tools available online that give us access to information and to data. Now, Sabrine, well, we have online several guides and resources at Piétons Québec, Pedestrians Québec, that we welcome you to consult. Okay, well, we are now at the Q&A portion of our meeting. That is with the greater audience that is here with us today. So there are questions both from people attending and online. So you can address your question to a given panelist if you want. Please keep this in mind, but you don't have to. Okay, hello. I'd like to hear more about accessibility in a territory that has been redesigned. Well, Pierre-Etienne, this brings us back to the idea of universal accessibility. So we have a tool that is called walkability, namely in public spaces. And this addresses safety, of course, but also what does universal accessibility mean? So, for example, let us think of disabilities, physical, cognitive, and actually some of the tools and the metrics do exist so that we can evaluate how a space is changing, how a space is being implemented. Amélie, what would you say? Well, I like the MAPA audit that is developed with colleagues at University of Montreal, namely Sébastien Laure and others. So this is a walkability tool that is maybe not so much on universal accessibility, but more about atmosphere in a space, namely for the elderly. And when we think of the elderly, well, we're all going to be elders one day. So once again, there's an idea. So that it's about what metrics can we look at. So now here's a question. If you had to do one thing to improve accessibility, which one would you prioritize? Preceding question was partially cut off. Okay, well, I would say, says Pierre-Etienne, is to take the pedestrian in a wide perspective. Somebody on a wheelchair is also, in a way, a form of pedestrian. So what is the conception of a pedestrian and how does everything else become integrated from there? Because there are always pedestrians in spaces, in many of the spaces. Well, what I would add is that we think of mobility with respect to people more than vehicles. So we need to think of collective mobility so as to perhaps better meet as the whole, to the whole of the population. And yes, this also has a domino effect, as we can imagine. Another question. When we address universal accessibility, people have the impression of charity initiatives, if not socialist initiatives, when this is not quite the case. So how do we demonstrate, for example, the indirect economic benefits of universal accessibility? And this brings us back to safety, to public health. to living spaces. And let's say it, we do live in a world where money speaks. Well, Pierre-Etienne, with respect to universal accessibility, well, the cost associated to people who cannot use infrastructures is not taken into consideration very often. What we often put forth is to think of a space so that someone with many functional limitations can access it, and then we become universal. Everybody can access. So when we think of people who have disabilities, they can tell us a lot with respect to what needs to be done. So for example, we spoke about this earlier on, if a store becomes accessible to people who have disabilities, it favors accessibility to young mothers, it favors accessibility to people who deliver goods, and so on and forth. So it's not about planning the use of space for particular groups, because there are effects on other groups. And it's also about changing our whole idea of what is a normal human being. Now, when we think of regulations, does this favor the idea of social measures? Juan, well, it's easier to calculate costs as a metric in comparison to some of the cause and effect and the consequences. Let us think of human dignity. Somebody who is disabled for whatever reason, how do we measure that? So this is also a challenge. What metrics do we use? What metrics do we look at? So when we think of sustainability, we often look at costs, but it becomes difficult to look at other impacts. All the same, I don't think it's quite enough to think of universal accessibility. And let me explain. It's not that I'm against the idea. It would be pretty late to say this, wouldn't it? But when we think of occupational therapy, for example, there are different ways of thinking where, for example, there are three aspects to consider. One, spaces that favor health, general health. So spaces that will not be a nuisance with respect to health. So that's the basis. Two, there are environments that can counterbalance differences in the members of the population. This is another level. And thirdly, still thinking of occupational therapy, is how can the environments contribute to the betterment of the individuals using it? How does it transform the people? How does it favor the learning of strategies to adapt to these environments given their own projects? All the while knowing that despite best intentions, there are limits, even when we think of the different issues at stake in an evolving society. So I would say this is about the capacity of spaces to be an open invitation to all, so that we can invent ourselves and to develop the capacity of taking action. So this is maybe about nuancing universal accessibility. And universal accessibility may limit us with respect to certain targets. So the three aspects that I've just addressed, in my opinion, are indispensable. Well, thank you. Another question online. With respect to socioeconomic accessibility for public transportation, what measures should be implemented so things become equal for all? Sabrine, well, we haven't spoken much about women. since the beginning of this webcast. And there's been a study by ADS Plus that has demonstrated that women depend much more on walking and public transport in comparison to men. And therefore, it's important to make sure that all forms of mobility are accessible, that mobility is accessible to all, that people may walk, may take public transport efficiently, and this would then allow a substantial portion of the population, women here, to be more efficiently mobile and thus have a more pleasant life. Any other comments? Seems we're good. So time for one last question in the room. Okay. Is there a competitive benchmark study of other cities? Because in Montreal, well, there are so many construction sites, it becomes very difficult, and there is a lot being done for electrical vehicles right now. But what happens next? Because the work that is being done right now on this will obviously create lots of issues for the future. Juan, I don't know about comparisons between Montreal and other cities in this particular respect, but there is a movement worldwide, so to speak, to better manage construction sites, namely with regards to social accessibility. And among some of the measures that have been adopted, well, there's the issue of communication of what is being done. There's also celebrating construction sites. There will always be construction sites that do have a goal of betterment. So how can we consider them as something normal rather than anomaly? And back to what has been studied in different countries, well, I think of different groups that have tried to manage everything that surrounds construction sites with respect to mitigating various consequences on its different users, meaning the users of that space. How do they navigate the construction site? Well, lovely idea to celebrate some of these sites. Pierre-Etienne, yes. We have certainly raised questions in this idea, and it's true when we think of Montreal and the many sites that there are there, and let us think of the people who have genuine disabilities, cognitive, physical, they are certainly affected. And so there has been studies in this respect, and that consider what is actually present on the site, and thus renders more interesting, sexier. Well, yeah, there's that, but it's actually a good news to think that we are improving the content of the site. But especially when a site is present for a long time, I would say we need to further reflect on many of these issues. Sites are here to remain, but essentially, how do we minimize the nuisance that is associated to this site? Now, that is substantial work in and of itself. Sabrine, and as you were saying earlier on, there is regulation that can be implemented. Well, thank you. Thank you to all four of you, and thank you for this rich discussion for complementary point of views. We've all learned immensely. And thank you to the Agence de Mobilité Durable that has organized this panel today. Thank you for the people who are with us here today, for all those who have attended online as well, and for those who are here for such a panel for the first time. Well, please know several of them are organized throughout the year, so there will be more in the future. So stay abreast of the agency's communications. They will provide themes to the meetings. And so please go to RDV, Agence Mobilité MTL online, and you will see what is upcoming. So wishing you all a wonderful day with many thanks.